The letter in Clara Whitmore's hand was already bleeding ink from the rain when she stepped off the train into Red Hollow. 3 people had tried to stop her from going up that mountain. The barkeeper, the postmaster, the woman at the boarding house who'd grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks. "He'll ruin you," she'd whispered. "Men like Caleb Ridge, they don't come back from what broke them." Clara had pulled free and walked into the storm anyway, because she hadn't traveled 800 miles to turn back at warnings. She'd come to face the man everyone else had abandoned. If you want to see how far this story can go, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. Let me know you're watching from somewhere out there in the world. The rain turned the mountain road into something mean. Mud sucked at Clara's boots with every step, and the hem of her dress, already ruined, clung to her calves like wet rope. She'd left her trunk at the boarding house, taking only what fit in the leather satchel across her chest. The letter, a change of clothes, matches that probably wouldn't light anymore, and her father's old pocket watch. The watch had stopped working 2 years ago, but she carried it anyway. The trail wasn't marked. The postmaster had said it wouldn't be. "Caleb don't want visitors," he told her that morning, arms crossed over a stained apron. "Trail's grown over on purpose. You won't find it unless you're meant to." "Then I'll be meant to," Clara had said. He'd looked at her like she was simple. Maybe she was. She'd quit a teaching position in Pennsylvania, sold everything she owned except what fit in that trunk, and bought a one-way ticket west based on a letter she'd found in her mother's things after the funeral. A letter that made no sense. A letter addressed to a man her mother had never mentioned, in a town Clara had never heard of, about a debt that apparently needed settling. The letter had been sealed. Clara had opened it anyway. "Caleb Ridge, the time has come to honor what was promised. My daughter knows nothing of our arrangement, but she will come to you when I am gone. What you owe cannot be repaid in money. You know what must be done. Margaret Whitmore." That was it. No explanation, no context, just coordinates written on the back and a date from 23 years ago, 2 years before Clara was born. She'd spent 3 weeks trying to ignore it. Then she'd bought the train ticket. Now, halfway up a mountain in a rainstorm, Clara was starting to think the postmaster might have been right about her being simple. The trees closed in tighter the higher she climbed. Ponderosa pines, thick and dark, their branches cutting the gray sky into pieces. The air smelled like wet bark and something sharper, wood smoke maybe. A sign that she was getting close. Her foot slipped on her root and she went down hard, one knee slamming into stone. The pain shot up her leg bright and immediate, and she bit down on a curse that would have made her students' parents pull them out of her classroom. She stayed there for a minute, breathing through her teeth, waiting for the worst of it to pass. When she looked up, there was a man standing 20 feet ahead on the trail. Clara's heart kicked against her ribs. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't called out. He just stood there in the rain, watching her with an expression that gave away nothing. Tall, taller than her father had been, and her father had been a big man. Dark hair plastered to his forehead, beard that looked like it had been trimmed with a knife and not much care. He wore a canvas coat gone black with water and boots that had seen more mountains than most men ever would. Caleb Ridge. Had to be. Clara pushed herself up, ignoring the way her knees screamed in protest. She didn't brush the mud off her dress, didn't try to fix her hair. She just stood there and met his eyes. "I'm looking for Caleb Ridge," she said. "You found him." His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "Turn around." "No." Something flickered across his face. Not anger, something closer to exhaustion. "I don't know you," he said. "Don't know why you're here. Don't care. Trail's dangerous in the rain. Go back before you break your neck." "My mother was Margaret Whitmore." That stopped him. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, Caleb Ridge looked like a man who'd just taken a bullet and was still trying to figure out where it came from. Then his face went blank again, smooth as river stone. "She's dead," Clara said, because it seemed like something he needed to hear out loud. 6 weeks ago. Fever took her fast. I found a letter in her things, addressed to you." He didn't move, didn't speak. Clara reached into her satchel and pulled out the envelope. The rain had gotten to it despite the oilcloth wrapping. Ink bled across the front where her mother's handwriting used to be sharp and sure. "I don't know what arrangement you had with her," Clara said. "I don't know what she thought you owed. But I came to deliver this, and I'm not leaving until you read it." Caleb stared at the letter like it might bite him. "You shouldn't have come," he said finally. Probably not. People in town tell you about me? Some. Then you know I'm not the kind of man a woman comes looking for. Clara tilted her head. They said you were a thief, a liar, that you burned down Jonas Kern's barn and let his horses run wild into the canyon, that you disappeared before the law could hang you. And you came anyway. The barkeeper also said you were innocent, that Kern lied to cover his own gambling debts, that the whole town turned on you because it was easier than admitting they were wrong. Caleb's jaw tightened. Barkeeper talks too much. He was drunk, Clara said. I bought him 3 whiskeys. People tell the truth when they think it doesn't matter anymore. For a long moment, the only sound was rain drumming on the canopy above them. Water dripped from the brim of Caleb's hat, ran down the sides of his face. He looked like a man who'd stopped expecting anything good to walk up his mountain a long time ago. Your mother, he said slowly, shouldn't have written that letter. But she did. It doesn't concern you. Then tell me what it says. No. Clara took a step forward. Her knee buckled slightly and she caught herself, refusing to show the pain. I sold everything I owned to get here. I've got $43 left and a boarding house room I can afford for maybe 2 more weeks. I didn't come all this way to have a conversation in the rain and leave empty-handed. You're going to leave empty-handed anyway. Fine. Clara shoved the letter toward him. Then take it, read it, burn it. I don't care. But I kept my mother's word by bringing it to you, and now you're going to keep yours by telling me what the hell this is about. Caleb looked at her for a long time. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that looked like winter sky before snow. Hard to read. Harder to hold. Then he took the letter. His hands were scarred. Old burns on the knuckles. A healed cut across the back of his left thumb. Working hands. He turned the envelope over once, twice, like he was weighing something he couldn't see. Go back to town, he said quietly. Come back tomorrow if you're still set on answers. I'll have some by then. I can wait while you read it. No. The word came out sharper than before, not loud, but final. You can't. Clara wanted to push. Every instinct said to stand her ground, force the issue, make him open the letter right there in front of her. But something in the way he held it, careful, like it might fall apart, made her stop. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow. She nodded and turned back down the trail. Her knee hurt worse now, a deep ache that promised a hell of a bruise by morning. She didn't look back, didn't need to. She could feel him watching her go, standing there in the rain with a letter from a dead woman and questions he probably didn't want answered. The walk back down took twice as long. By the time Clara reached the edge of town, the rain had softened to mist, and the sky was starting to bruise purple with dusk. Red Hollow looked like a lot of mountain towns she'd passed through on the way west. One main street, buildings that leaned slightly, a church with a steeple that had seen better days. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers got noticed. She was noticed. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. Halloway, a thin woman with eyes like a hawk, looked up from her knitting when Clara came through the door. You went up there, she said. Not a question. I did. And I'm going back tomorrow. Mrs. Halloway's needles stopped clicking. Girl, I don't know what you think you're doing, but Caleb Ridge isn't a man you want tangled up in your life. Whatever your mother owed him, how do you know my mother owed him anything? The silence that followed was the loud kind. The kind that said Clara had just asked a question everyone had been pretending didn't exist. Mrs. Halloway set down her knitting. Your mother stayed here once, long time ago, before you were born. Clara's stomach dropped. When? 23 years, maybe? She was traveling through, stayed 3 nights, kept to herself mostly, but I remember her. Pretty woman, sad eyes. Mrs. Halloway paused. She met with Caleb twice while she was here. Don't know what about, but after she left, he changed. Changed how? Got quieter, worked harder, stopped coming into town except when he had to. Then the business with Kern happened, and she shook her head. Doesn't matter now. What's done is done. Clara wanted to press, but Mrs. Halloway had already picked her knitting back up. Her mouth set in a line that said the conversation was over. Upstairs, Clara's room was small and cold. A bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the back alley. She peeled off her wet dress and hung it over the chair, then sank onto the mattress in her chemise and felt every mile she'd traveled settle into her bones. Her mother had been here, in this town, in this boarding house, 23 years ago. Clara pulled the pocket watch from her satchel and turned it over in her hands. The inscription on the back was worn smooth from years of her father carrying it. Time waits for no man, but love does. Her father had loved her mother completely. Clara had never doubted that. But now, sitting in a rented room in a town her mother had visited in secret, she wondered what else she'd never doubted that might have been wrong. Sleep didn't come easy. When it finally did, Clara dreamed of mountains and men with gray eyes and a letter that burned without ever catching fire. Morning came too bright. Clara's knee had swollen overnight, stiff and angry, but she wrapped it tight and laced her boots over the bandage. She'd made worse walks on worse injuries. The trail was easier to see in daylight. Still steep, still muddy in places, but the rain had passed and the sun cut through the trees in clean white lines. Clara climbed steady, her breath misting in the cold air, and tried not to think about what she'd say when she got there. The ranch appeared suddenly, the way things do in mountains. One minute just trees, the next a clearing with a cabin and a barn and fences that looked like they'd been mended 100 times. Smoke curled from the chimney, a few chickens scratched in the yard. It looked almost normal, except for the silence. No dogs barking, no voices, just wind moving through pine branches and the faint sound of an axe splitting wood somewhere behind the barn. Clara walked toward the sound. Caleb was there, stripped to his shirt sleeves despite the cold, working through a pile of logs that would have taken most men a week to split. His movements were efficient, practiced, lift, position, swing, split, no wasted motion. He didn't look up when Clara stopped at the edge of the woodpile, but he knew she was there. "You're stubborn," he said, "so I've been told." He drove the axe into the chopping block and straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. Up close, in daylight, Clara could see the details she'd missed in the rain, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the lines around his mouth that came from years of not smiling, the way his shoulders carried weight that had nothing to do with split wood. "I read the letter," Caleb said. Clara waited. "Your mother and I made an agreement a long time ago. She needed help. I gave it. In return, she promised me something." He paused. "She promised me you." The words hung in the air like smoke. "Excuse me?" Caleb's expression didn't change. "Not the way you're thinking. Your mother was dying when she came here. Same fever that took her now tried to take her then. The doctor in town had given up. I knew a man up north, a healer, some called him. I rode 3 days to bring him back. He saved her life. And in return she promised you her daughter." Clara's voice was flat. "That's insane. It wasn't like that." For the first time, something that might have been frustration crossed Caleb's face. "She was grateful. Said she owed me a debt she couldn't repay. I told her I didn't want repayment. She insisted. Said if she ever had a daughter, she'd send her to me when the time was right. I thought she was talking out of fever dreams. I forgot about it. But she didn't. No." Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. "What does that mean? Send me to you for what?" Caleb looked away toward the mountains rising dark and sharp against the sky. "I don't know. The letter doesn't say. Just that you're here because she kept her word, and now I have to keep mine." "Which is?" "I don't know that either." Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So I came all this way for a promise neither of you understood, to settle a debt that doesn't make sense, with a man who doesn't want me here. Is that about right?" "That's about right." She should have been angry, should have felt betrayed or manipulated, or at least annoyed, but all Clara felt was tired. Bone deep, soul tired. The kind of tired that came from realizing the story you'd been told your whole life had pages missing. "My father," she said carefully, "died when I was 16. Logging accident. My mother never remarried, never even looked at another man, far as I could tell. She loved him completely. I'm sure she did. But she came here before I was born. Made this promise. To you." Caleb picked up the axe again, running his thumb along the blade. "People make promises for a lot of reasons. Doesn't mean they're all the same kind of promise." "Then what kind was this?" "The kind you keep because breaking it would break something in yourself." Clara studied him, the set of his shoulders, the careful way he wasn't looking at her, the white-knuckle grip on the axe handle. "You didn't want me to come." "No, Because you don't want to owe anyone anything. Because I don't know what your mother expected me to do with you, and I'm not a man who handles expectations well. The honesty of it surprised her. Most men would have dressed it up, made it sound better than it was. Caleb just said it plain and let it land however it landed. Well, Clara said, I don't know what she expected either, so I guess we're both lost. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of Caleb's mouth. It was gone before Clara could be sure she'd seen it. You planning to stay in town? He asked. For a while, until I figure out what's next. And then? I don't know. I don't have much to go back to. Caleb nodded slowly, like that was an answer he understood. There's work, if you need it. Mrs. Halloway's always looking for help at the boarding house. Doc Martin could use someone who can read and write. I can do more than read and write. Didn't say you couldn't. Clara felt her chin lift. I taught school for 8 years. Mathematics, literature, basic science. I can keep books, manage supplies, organize just about anything that needs organizing. Town doesn't have a school. Then maybe it should. This time the smile definitely happened. Small, brief, but real. You've been here one day and you're already trying to fix things. Is that a problem? Depends on what you're trying to fix. The weight of the words settled between them. Clara knew what he was really asking. Are you here to fix me? The answer should have been no. Should have been easy. But standing there in his woodyard, watching him watch her with those winter sky eyes, Clara wasn't sure what the answer was anymore. I should go, she said. Caleb nodded. Trail's easier in daylight. Watch the loose stones near the bottom. She turned to leave, then stopped. Can I come back? The question surprised them both. Why would you? Caleb asked. Because I don't think this is finished. Whatever my mother started, whatever she thought she was doing, it doesn't end with me delivering a letter and walking away. Does it? He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough again. No, I don't think it does. Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow, Clara walked back down the mountain with more questions than she'd climbed up with, and the strange feeling that she'd just agreed to something she didn't fully understand. But for the first time since her mother died, she didn't feel lost. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Clara came back the next day with a basket. She hadn't planned it. Mrs. Halloway had been baking bread that morning, and when Clara mentioned she was heading up the mountain again, the older woman had gone quiet for a moment before wrapping 2 loaves in cloth and shoving them into Clara's hands. Man's gotta eat, was all she said. So Clara climbed the trail with bread she hadn't baked, to visit a man she barely knew because of a promise she didn't understand. When she thought about it too hard, it sounded crazy. So she stopped thinking about it. The ranch looked different in morning light. Less lonely, maybe. Or maybe Clara was just seeing it without rain turning everything gray. The chickens were out again, pecking at scattered grain near the barn. Someone had mended the fence post that had been leaning yesterday. It stood straight now, the new wood pale against the weathered rails. Caleb was working on the barn roof, hammer in hand, a line of nails held between his teeth. He saw her coming and climbed down the ladder without hurrying, pulling the nails from his mouth and dropping them into his shirt pocket. You're making a habit of this, he said. Mrs. Halloway sent bread. Clara held up the basket. I'm just the delivery person. He looked at the basket like it might be a trap. She didn't have to do that. I know, she did anyway. For a moment, Caleb just stood there, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. Then he gestured toward the cabin. Coffee's still hot if you want some. The inside of the cabin was cleaner than Clara expected. Simple. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, shelves lined with canned goods and supplies. Everything had its place. Everything looked used but cared for. A rifle hung above the door. Books sat stacked on a corner shelf, their spines cracked from reading. Caleb poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one in front of Clara without asking if she wanted it. The coffee was strong enough to stand a spoon in, the way working men made it. Clara drank it black and didn't complain. You read a lot, she said, nodding toward the books. Not much else to do up here in winter. What do you read? Whatever the post office has. History mostly. Some poetry, though I don't understand half of it. Clara smiled despite herself. Poetry's not meant to be understood. It's meant to be felt. Then I don't feel it either. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee that was too strong and eating bread that was better than either of them deserved. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. Clara's knee had stopped throbbing sometime during the climb, or maybe she'd just stopped noticing. "Why'd you really come back?" Caleb asked finally. Clara set down her cup. "Honestly? I don't know. I should probably go back east, find another teaching position, start over somewhere that makes sense, but every time I think about leaving, something stops me." "Your mother's promise." "Maybe, or maybe I'm just tired of running away from things I don't understand." Caleb studied her over the rim of his cup. "And you think staying here will help you understand?" "I think staying anywhere long enough helps you understand something." He almost smiled again. Almost. "You're an odd woman, Clara Whitmore." "I've been called worse." The conversation drifted after that, falling into the kind of comfortable quiet that usually took people months to find with each other. Clara told him about Pennsylvania, about teaching children who'd rather be anywhere else, about her father's death and her mother's slow retreat into silence afterward. Caleb listened without interrupting, without offering empty sympathy, and somehow that made it easier to talk. When she asked about the ranch, he gave short answers at first. Bought it 12 years ago, runs a few head of cattle, trades furs in winter, keeps to himself. But as the coffee pot emptied and the morning stretched toward noon, the answers got longer. He told her about the first winter up here, when he'd nearly frozen to death because he didn't know how to bank a fire properly. About the mountain lion that kept taking his chickens until he built a better coop. About the silence, and how it had taken him 2 years to stop being afraid of it. "Why were you afraid?" Clara asked. "Because silence makes you think, and thinking makes you remember things you'd rather forget." "Like what happened with Jonas Kern?" Caleb's expression hardened. "I don't talk about that." "The barkeeper said—" "I don't care what the barkeeper said." His voice went flat. "That part of my life is over. I paid for it whether I did it or not, and I'm not digging it back up for anyone." Clara knew she should leave it alone, should change the subject, smooth things over, keep the peace. But she'd never been good at leaving things alone. "Did you do it?" she asked quietly. Caleb stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "I think you should go." "I'm not trying to—" "I know what you're trying to do. Everyone who comes up here tries to do it. They want the story. They want to know if the rumors are true, if I'm the monster they think I am, if there's some tragic reason that explains everything." He crossed to the door and opened it. "I don't owe you that story, Clara. I don't owe anyone." She should have been afraid, should have felt threatened by the anger in his voice, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the door frame hard enough to make the wood creak. But all Clara felt was sad. "You're right," she said, standing. "You don't owe me anything. I'm sorry." The apology seemed to take the wind out of him. His shoulders dropped slightly, and some of the hardness left his face. "I didn't do it," he said quietly. "But that doesn't matter anymore. The damage was done whether I swung the torch or not." Clara picked up the basket, leaving the remaining bread on the table. "For what it's worth, I believe you." "Why? You don't know me." "No, but I know what it looks like when someone's been carrying a lie they didn't earn." She moved toward the door, pausing when she reached him. "My father was blamed for a logging accident that killed 2 men. He was the foreman. It didn't matter that the equipment was faulty, that he'd reported it 3 times, that the company ignored him. He was responsible, so he carried it until the day he died." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and Clara saw recognition in his eyes, the kind of recognition that came from shared scars. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "Me too." She left before either of them could say anything else, walking back down the mountain with an empty basket and the feeling that she'd just crossed some invisible line she couldn't uncross. That night, Mrs. Halloway asked if she'd be going back up tomorrow. Clara said yes before she'd even thought about it. The pattern established itself without either of them planning it. Clara would climb the mountain in the morning, usually carrying something, bread, eggs from the boarding house chickens, once a jar of preserves that Mrs. Halloway insisted was taking up too much shelf space. Caleb would be working on something when she arrived, and they'd fall into an easy routine of shared tasks and sparse conversation. Clara learned that Caleb was left-handed, that he couldn't carry a tune but hummed anyway when he thought no one was listening, that he took his coffee with nothing in it but would drink it sweet if that's how it was made. She learned he was patient with broken things, fences, tools, even the half-wild barn cat that showed up one morning with a torn ear. He set the cat's leg without flinching when it clawed him, wrapped it carefully, and left scraps near the barn until it started staying. Caleb learned that Clara couldn't cook worth a damn but could organize anything, that she read faster than anyone he'd ever met, that she had a habit of biting her thumbnail when she was thinking through a problem. He learned she wasn't afraid of hard work, even when it left her hands blistered and her back aching. She'd helped him re-shingle part of the barn roof without being asked, had cleaned out the chicken coop without complaint, had even helped him drag a fallen tree off the north fence line. "You don't have to do all this," he told her one afternoon, watching her stack firewood with the kind of precision that spoke to an organized mind. "I know." "Then why do you?" Clara wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Because you'd do it alone if I didn't, and that seems like a waste." "A waste of what?" "Of company." It was such a simple answer, and it hit Caleb harder than it should have. Company. He'd gone so long without it that he'd forgotten it was something people needed. Something he needed, even if he'd convinced himself otherwise. 3 weeks passed like that. Then 4. Clara's room at the boarding house became less temporary, her few belongings spreading out to fill the space. She started helping Mrs. Halloway with the books. The woman's eyesight was failing, and she'd been making mistakes in her ledgers. In exchange, Mrs. Halloway stopped charging her full rent. The town started talking, of course. Small towns always did. Clara heard the whispers in the general store, saw the looks when she walked past the saloon. The school teacher from back east, spending her days with the man everyone knew was trouble. Some folks were concerned, others were scandalized. A few were just curious. Doc Martin was the first to say something out loud. "You know what you're doing?" he asked one morning when Clara stopped by to pick up supplies he'd asked her to deliver to Caleb, bandages and liniment, things a man living alone needed. "I'm delivering medicine." "That's not what I mean." Clara met his eyes. Doc Martin was old, pushing 70, with hands that shook slightly but a gaze that missed nothing. "I know what you mean, and yes, I know what I'm doing." "Do you? Because Caleb Ridge isn't a project you can fix, girl. He's a man who's been broken in ways that don't heal clean." "I'm not trying to fix him." "Then what are you trying to do?" Clara thought about it, really thought about it. "I'm trying to be his friend. Is that allowed?" Doc Martin's expression softened. "It's allowed. Just be careful. This town hurt him once. It'll hurt you too if you're not watching." The warning stuck with Clara as she climbed the mountain that afternoon. The trail had become familiar now. She knew which routes to avoid, where the ground turned soft after rain, which turn meant she was halfway there. Her knee had healed completely. The bruise faded to nothing, but she still favored it slightly out of habit. Caleb was chopping wood again when she arrived. He'd been chopping a lot of wood lately, more than one man could possibly need. Clara had started to realize it was what he did when something was bothering him. Put an axe in his hands and worked until whatever was eating at him got quiet. "Doc Martin says hello," she said, setting the supplies on the porch. Caleb buried the axe in the chopping block. "Doc Martin's a gossip. He's concerned." "About what?" "About you. About me. About what people are saying." Caleb grabbed his shirt from where it hung on the fence rail and pulled it on, his jaw tight. "Let them say what they want. Doesn't change anything." "Doesn't it?" He looked at her, and Clara saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not anger, something more complicated. "You worried about your reputation?" "No." "Then why bring it up?" "Because you're worried about mine." The accusation hung between them. Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked toward the cabin without answering. Clara followed. Inside, he poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed his face and hands with hard, precise movements. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I spent 5 years being the man everyone talked about. The thief, the liar, the one who got away with it. I know what that does to a person." He dried his hands on a towel, not looking at her. "You don't deserve that." "Maybe I get to decide what I deserve." "You think you do, but you don't know this town like I do. You don't know how it gets inside you, how it makes you question everything about yourself until you don't know what's true anymore." Clara crossed her arms. "So what are you saying? That I should stop coming here? That we should stop whatever this is?" "I'm saying you should think about what you're risking." I have thought about it. And? And I'm still here. Caleb finally looked at her, and the rawness in his expression nearly made Clara step back. Why? Why are you still here, Clara? Your mother's promise doesn't explain it. Boredom doesn't explain it. What are you getting out of this? The question was fair. Clara had asked herself the same thing a dozen times, usually late at night when she couldn't sleep, when the sensible part of her brain listed all the reasons she should pack her trunk and leave. But there was another part, quieter and deeper, that knew the answer. I'm getting to know someone who doesn't lie to me, she said. Everyone back home lied. They said my mother was fine when she was dying. They said my father's death wasn't his fault, then fired me because they didn't want the scandal associated with their school. They said they cared, but they scattered the second things got hard. She moved closer, close enough to see the muscle working in Caleb's jaw. You don't lie. You don't pretend. You are exactly who you are, and that's broken. Honest. The word landed like a stone in still water. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb turned away, his shoulders rising and falling with a breath that looked like it hurt. You barely know me, he said quietly. I know enough. You know what I let you see. Then let me see more. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You don't want that. Stop telling me what I want. The sharpness in Clara's voice surprised them both. She wasn't angry, not really, but she was tired. Tired of being handled like something fragile. Tired of men deciding what was best for her. Tired of being protected from truths she had every right to face. Caleb turned back to her, and something in his expression had shifted. You want to see more? Fine. I wake up every morning wondering if today's the day I'll stop being able to do this. This, he gestured around the cabin. This whole thing where I pretend I'm fine living alone, pretend the silence doesn't make me crazy, pretend I don't remember what it was like to have people look at me like I was human instead of something that needed avoiding. He crossed to the window, staring out at the mountains. I spent 6 months after the Kern business living in a tent because I couldn't stand being in town. Couldn't stand the looks, the whispers, the way people crossed the street to avoid me. I came up here thinking I'd disappear, thought maybe that's what I deserved, and for a long time I was fine with it. More than fine, I wanted it. Clara stayed quiet, letting him talk. Then you showed up with your mother's letter and your stubborn streak, and everything I built to protect myself started cracking. He turned to face her. You want to know why I chop so much wood? Because when you're here, I can't stop thinking about what happens when you leave. And when you're not here, I can't stop hoping you'll come back. And both of those things scare the hell out of me. The confession settled between them, raw and unpolished. Clara felt her heart doing something complicated in her chest. I scare you, she said softly. Yes. Because you don't want to need anyone. Because I already do. The admission cost him. Clara could see it in the way his hands flexed at his sides, in the tension across his shoulders, in the careful blankness he was trying to pull back over his expression. This was a man who'd survived by keeping people at a distance, and she'd somehow gotten past every wall he'd built. I need you too, Clara said. Caleb's eyes snapped to hers. I don't have anyone left, she continued. My parents are dead. My friends back home were really just colleagues who didn't know what to do with me after I left. I came here because of a letter, but I stayed because for the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm pretending. She took a breath. When I'm here, I can just be. I don't have to be the competent teacher or the dutiful daughter or the woman who has it all figured out. I can just be Clara. And you let me. I don't let you do anything. Exactly. The ghost of a smile touched Caleb's mouth. We're a mess, aren't we? Pretty much. He moved away from the window, closing some of the distance between them. I don't know how to do this. Be someone's... He stopped, searching for the word. Friend? Clara offered. Is that what this is? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe it's something else. But whatever it is, I'm not running from it. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and Clara saw the war happening behind his eyes. The part of him that wanted to believe her fighting the part that had learned not to trust good things. Okay, he said finally. Okay? Okay. You can keep coming up here. Keep bringing bread and fixing things that don't need fixing and organizing my supplies in ways that make me crazy. Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Your supplies were chaos. They were fine. They were a disaster. I knew where everything was. In the general area of the shelf, sure. They were both smiling now, real smiles that reached their eyes, and the tension that had filled the cabin began to ease. Caleb moved to the stove and put the coffee pot back on to heat. "Stay for dinner," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Clara thought about the boarding house, about Mrs. Halloway's knowing looks, and the cold room waiting for her, about eating alone at a corner table while other guests pretended not to stare. "What are you making?" she asked. "Venison stew. Had it going since this morning." "You made stew?" "I can cook." "I didn't say you couldn't." "You looked surprised." Clara laughed. "I'm surprised. Most men I know can barely boil water. Most men you know haven't spent years cooking for themselves." Fair point. The stew was better than Clara expected. Rich and thick, with potatoes and carrots and meat that fell apart at the touch of a fork. They ate at the small table while evening light slanted through the windows, turning everything gold and amber. Outside, the chickens settled in for the night, making soft sounds in the growing dark. "Tell me about your mother," Caleb said as he pushed his empty bowl away. "Before she got sick." Clara thought about it, sorting through memories. She was quiet, loved reading, always had a book nearby. She used to tell me stories at night, made-up ones about brave women who went on adventures. Looking back, I think those stories said more about what she wanted than who she was. "What do you mean?" The women in her stories were always leaving, always choosing something over safety. She never did that. She married my father, settled down, lived a life that looked perfect from the outside. But it wasn't? I don't know. I thought it was. But now I wonder if she spent her whole life being what everyone expected instead of who she wanted to be. Clara traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "That letter she wrote you, it's the only time I've seen evidence of her making a choice that didn't make sense. And she never told me about it, never mentioned this town or you or any of it. Maybe she was protecting you. From what?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "From the truth that sometimes the right choice and the sensible choice aren't the same thing." The words settled over Clara like a blanket. She thought about her mother climbing this same mountain 23 years ago, meeting with Caleb twice, making a promise that would outlive her. She thought about the life her mother had lived afterward, safe, respectable, small. And she thought about herself, sitting in a cabin on a mountain with a man the world had decided wasn't worth knowing. "I should go," she said, though she didn't move. "It's getting dark." "I'll walk you down." "You don't have to." "I know." They descended the trail together as twilight turned the forest blue and purple. Caleb carried a lantern even though they didn't need it yet, and Clara noticed how he positioned himself on the downhill side, ready to catch her if she slipped. He didn't comment on it, and neither did she. At the bottom of the trail, where the trees thinned and Red Hollow's lights became visible, Caleb stopped. "Tomorrow?" he asked. Clara smiled. "Tomorrow." She was halfway back to the boarding house when she realized they'd just made a promise. Nothing formal, nothing spoken outright, but a promise nonetheless. The kind that said this wasn't temporary, wasn't just passing time, wasn't something either of them could walk away from easily anymore. And for the first time since her mother died, Clara wasn't afraid of what came next. The first snow came early that year, dusting the mountains white in mid-October. Clara woke to find frost on her window and Mrs. Halloway stoking the fire in the common room with more urgency than usual. "Winter comes fast up here," the older woman said when Clara came downstairs. "Gets in your bones if you're not ready for it." Clara thought about Caleb alone on the mountain and felt something tighten in her chest. "How bad does it get?" "Bad enough. Trail becomes impossible once the heavy snow hits. Could be a week, could be 3 months. Mrs. Halloway gave her a knowing look. "Anyone who's planning on staying up there better stock up now." Clara was on the trail before noon, carrying supplies she'd bought at the general store. Flour, salt, dried beans, coffee. The climb was harder with the extra weight, and her breath came in white puffs that hung in the cold air. When she reached the ranch, Caleb was reinforcing the barn with extra boards, his movements efficient despite the temperature. He saw the supplies and frowned. "You didn't need to do that." "Mrs. Halloway said the trail might close." "It will." "Then you'll need these." Caleb set down his hammer and came to take the pack from her. His hands brushed hers, and Clara noticed how cold they were, despite the work gloves. "I've been through worse winters than this." "I know. but now you don't have to. Something passed between them, an understanding that had nothing to do with supplies and everything to do with the fact that neither of them wanted to spend the next few months wondering if the other was all right. Caleb carried the pack inside without arguing, and Clara followed. The cabin was warmer than outside, but still carried the chill of morning. Caleb added wood to the stove and set the coffee pot to heat while Clara unpacked the supplies. She'd bought more than just staples. There was a book she'd noticed him looking at in the general store window, a new whetstone for his knives, even a tin of tobacco, though she wasn't sure he smoked. "You trying to provision me for a siege?" he asked, holding up the tobacco. "Doc Martin said you used to smoke a pipe. Quit 2 years ago." "Oh." Clara felt her face heat. "I can take it back?" "Don't." Caleb set the tin on the shelf next to the book and the whetstone. "Might take it up again if the winter's long enough." They fell into their usual routine after that, Clara organizing while Caleb worked, both of them finding excuses to stay in the same room. But there was an edge to it now, an awareness of time running out. Once the heavy snow came, Clara wouldn't be able to make the climb. They'd be separated by weather and distance, and neither of them knew for how long. "You ever think about leaving?" Clara asked as she folded a blanket she'd found draped over a chair. "Going somewhere that doesn't have winters like this? Every year? But you stay." "Yeah." "Why?" Caleb poured coffee and handed her a cup. "Because leaving would mean I let them win. The town, Kern, everyone who decided I wasn't worth the benefit of the doubt. I leave, and it proves they were right to push me out. That's stubborn." "So I've been told." Clara smiled despite herself. They'd had some version of this conversation before, dancing around the real questions neither of them wanted to ask. But with winter coming and time feeling suddenly finite, Clara found herself tired of dancing. "Tell me what really happened," she said, "with Jonas Kern." Caleb's expression closed off immediately. "I told you I don't talk about that." "I know, but I'm asking anyway." "Why? What difference does it make now?" "Because I want to understand. Because you're carrying it around like a weight, and I think telling someone might make it lighter. Or it might make you see me different." "Maybe. But I'd rather know the truth than spend the rest of my life guessing." Caleb was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee like it held answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and low. "Kern and I used to be friends. Not close, but friendly enough. We'd drink together sometimes, play cards at the saloon. He had a ranch about 10 miles south of here, ran it with his brother." Caleb paused, working his jaw. "He also had a problem with gambling. Lost more hands than he won, but he kept playing anyway. Started owing money all over town." Clara settled into the chair across from him, listening. "One night he came to me asking for a loan. Said he had a deal coming through, something big, just needed to cover his debts until it came in. I gave him what I had. Wasn't much, maybe $60. He promised he'd pay me back within a month." "Did he?" "No. 2 months went by, then 3. Every time I asked, he had another excuse. Then one night his barn burned down. Took half his cattle with it, his equipment, everything." Caleb's hands tightened around his cup. "Next morning the sheriff showed up at my door. Kern was with him, claiming I'd set the fire out of revenge for the money he owed me." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "That's insane." "That's what I said. But Kern had witnesses, or said he did. 2 men who claimed they saw someone matching my description near his property the night of the fire. Never mind that I was here, alone, like I always am. Never mind that I had no reason to burn down a barn over $60. What did the sheriff do? At first? Nothing. He knew me well enough to have doubts. But the town started talking, and talk turns into truth fast in a place this small. People remembered I'd been accused of stealing tools from the lumber mill 5 years before, charges that were dropped, but nobody remembers that part. They remembered I kept to myself, that I was standoffish, that I wasn't one of them. Caleb stood and walked to the window, his back to Clara. Kern kept pushing, said I'd threatened him, said I was dangerous, said the town needed to do something before I hurt someone else. The pressure built until the sheriff didn't have a choice. He arrested me. They put you in jail? For 3 days. Then they let me go because they couldn't make the charges stick. The witnesses Kern claimed to have disappeared, couldn't be found for questioning. The evidence, non-existent. The whole thing fell apart under even basic scrutiny. So you were cleared. On paper, yes. In reality, Caleb turned back to face her. I was guilty the moment Kern pointed his finger. Didn't matter that the charges were dropped. Didn't matter that his story had more holes than a sieve. People believed what they wanted to believe, and what they wanted to believe was that I did it. Clara felt anger rising in her chest, hot and sharp. That's not justice. No, it's not. What happened to Kern? His big deal came through about a month later. Turned out he'd sold a piece of his property to the railroad, made enough to cover his debts and then some. Rebuilt the barn, restocked his cattle, never paid me back the $60. Caleb's voice was flat now, emotionless. And he never admitted he lied. People must have figured it out. Some did. Most didn't care either way. The damage was done. I couldn't go into town without people staring, couldn't buy supplies without the shopkeepers watching me like I might steal something. My friends stopped coming around. Women crossed the street to avoid me. After 6 months of that, I stopped trying. So you came up here? So I came up here? The silence that followed was heavy. Clara tried to imagine it, being falsely accused, abandoned by everyone, convicted in the court of public opinion, with no way to defend yourself. She tried to imagine the loneliness, the anger, the slow erosion of faith in humanity. I would have burned the barn down for real after that, she said quietly. Caleb looked at her, surprised. Then he laughed, a real laugh, unexpected and rough around the edges. You say that now. I mean it. If someone did that to me, destroyed my life over a lie, I'd want revenge. Revenge doesn't fix anything. Maybe not, but it would feel good in the moment. Would it? Or would it just prove everyone right about who they thought I was? Clara considered that. Is that why you didn't fight back? Because you were afraid of proving them right? Part of it. The other part, Caleb moved away from the window, closer to where Clara sat. The other part was that fighting would have meant I cared what they thought, and I was tired of caring. So you came up here and stopped caring completely? Tried to. Did it work? He looked at her, really looked at her, and Clara saw the answer in his eyes before he said it. For a while. Then you showed up. The confession hung between them like smoke. Clara felt her heart doing that complicated thing again, the thing that happened whenever Caleb let his guard down enough to show her what was underneath. I'm sorry, she said. For what? For making you care again. Don't be. Caleb pulled out the other chair and sat down, close enough that Clara could see the scar through his eyebrow, the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. I was angry at first, angry that you wouldn't just leave, angry that you kept coming back, angry that I couldn't stop hoping you would. But somewhere along the way, the anger turned into something else. What? Relief, maybe, or gratitude. I don't know. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his own inability to name what he was feeling. All I know is that for the first time in years, I wake up and don't wish I hadn't. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say something profound, something that would match the weight of what he'd just given her. But all that came out was, I'm glad I make you not wish you were dead. Caleb smiled, and it transformed his face completely. You're terrible at accepting compliments. I'm terrible at a lot of things. Name one. Cooking. That's true. Your biscuits could break teeth. I know, my students used to joke that my cooking was more dangerous than my grading. They fell into easier conversation after that, the tension of Caleb's confession dissipating into something softer. But Clara couldn't stop thinking about what he'd told her. The false accusation, the abandonment, the years of isolation built on a lie. She thought about her mother's letter, about the promise that had brought her here, and wondered if maybe this was what her mother had known. That Caleb needed someone who would hear his story and stay anyway. The afternoon wore on and the temperature kept dropping. Caleb went back to work on the barn while Clara tackled the inside of the cabin, cleaning things that didn't need cleaning just to keep busy. She found herself noticing details she'd missed before. The way Caleb had carved small notches into the doorframe, marking something. The shelf of books organized by height instead of title. The second cup that sat beside his on the shelf, unused but there. When did you get the second cup? She called through the open door. Caleb looked up from where he was hammering. What? The second coffee cup. When did you buy it? He was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago. Why? In case someone visited. Did anyone? No. Clara picked up the cup and turned it over in her hands. It matched the one Caleb used. Same tin construction, same dented rim. He'd bought it 3 years ago and kept it on the shelf, waiting for a visitor who never came. Until she did. "You were ready for me," she said when Caleb came back inside, his work finished for the day. "What do you mean?" "The cup. You bought it years ago. You were ready for someone to show up." Caleb looked uncomfortable. "I wasn't ready for you specifically, but you were ready for someone." "Maybe. Or maybe I just didn't want to be the kind of man who only owned one cup." Clara smiled. "That's the most optimistic thing I've ever heard you say." "Don't get used to it." They made dinner together, or rather Caleb made dinner while Clara tried to help and mostly got in the way. The stew wasn't as good as last time, and the bread Clara had brought was starting to go stale, but neither of them complained. They ate while night pressed against the windows and the temperature dropped low enough to make the cabin walls creak. "Stay," Caleb said, as Clara started gathering her things to leave. She froze. "What?" "It's too cold to walk back tonight. Trail's probably icing over already. You could slip, break something, freeze before anyone found you." He wouldn't look at her. "I've got an extra blanket. You can take the bed. I'll sleep out here." Clara's mind raced. Staying meant spending the night in a man's cabin, unchaperoned, unmarried. In the town below, that would destroy what was left of her reputation. Mrs. Halloway would know she didn't come back. People would talk. But the alternative was walking down an icy mountain in the dark, and Clara wasn't stupid enough to think that was safe. "All right," she said. Caleb nodded once, sharp and quick, like he'd been braced for her to say no. He showed her to the small room off the main cabin, barely more than a closet with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. The blankets were worn but clean, and someone had clearly made an effort to keep the space livable, even though it was never used. "There's water in this pitcher if you need it," Caleb said from the doorway. And he stopped, looking uncertain for the first time since Clara had met him. "And what?" "And thank you for listening, for not," he gestured vaguely, "for not looking at me different after." "I told you I wouldn't." "I know, but people say a lot of things they don't mean." Clara crossed to the doorway, close enough to see the uncertainty in his expression. "I'm not people, Caleb. When I say something, I mean it." He searched her face like he was looking for proof of a lie, and couldn't find it. "I believe you." "Good." They stood there for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, neither of them quite ready to say goodnight. Then Caleb stepped back. "Sleep well," he said. "You too." Clara closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, her heart pounding. Through the thin wall, she could hear Caleb moving around the cabin, banking the fire, putting away dishes, settling down on what must have been a brutally uncomfortable arrangement of chairs and blankets. She should have felt awkward or nervous or worried about what staying here meant. Instead, she felt safe. She lay down fully clothed under the blankets and tried to sleep. It didn't come easy. Every sound Caleb made on the other side of the wall seemed amplified. His breathing, the creak of wood under his weight, the small, restless movements of someone unused to having another person so close. Clara wondered if he was regretting asking her to stay, if this was all a mistake, if morning would bring awkwardness neither of them knew how to handle. But when she finally drifted off, her last thought was that she'd never felt more at home than she did in a stranger's cabin on a mountain far from anywhere she'd ever belonged. She woke to the smell of coffee and pale light filtering through the window. For a moment, Clara couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came back. The cold, the offer to stay. Caleb's story about Kern and the fire and the lie that had destroyed his life. She got up and opened the door to find Caleb already awake, standing by the stove with 2 cups of coffee. He'd clearly been up for a while. His hair was damp like he'd washed, and he'd changed into a clean shirt. When he saw her, something crossed his face too quick to name. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He handed her a cup and they stood there drinking coffee in the early light, neither of them sure how to navigate this new territory they'd stumbled into. Outside, the world had turned white. Snow covered everything, the yard, the barn roof, the trees. It was beautiful and isolating in equal measure. "Trail's going to be bad," Caleb said, looking out the window. "I know. Might not be able to make it safely." Clara's stomach dropped. "How long?" "Hard to say. Could clear up in a few days. Could be longer." She thought about Mrs. Halloway, about the boarding house, about the town below that was already talking about her. Then she thought about trying to navigate an icy mountain trail alone and possibly dying for the sake of appearances. I'll risk it after breakfast, she said. Caleb's jaw tightened. That's stupid. Maybe, but staying longer is worse. Worse how? You'd rather break your neck than have people gossip? You know it's not that simple. Isn't it? He set down his cup with more force than necessary. You're worried about what they'll say. Fine. They're already saying it. They've been saying it since the first time you climbed this mountain. Staying one more night won't change that. It will make it worse. For who? For you or for me? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Clara realized with sudden clarity that Caleb wasn't worried about himself. He'd stopped caring what the town thought years ago. He was worried about her, about the reputation she'd lose, about becoming another casualty of his existence. For both of us, she said quietly. I can handle it. So can I. Then stay. The word came out rougher than he probably meant it to. At least until the trail's safe. I'll walk you down myself, make sure everyone sees you got stuck because of weather, not because of... Because of what? Caleb's expression hardened. Because of me. Clara felt something crack open in her chest. She set down her own cup and crossed to where Caleb stood, close enough to see the muscle working in his jaw, the careful blankness he was trying to pull over his face. You think you're the problem, she said. I know I am. You're wrong. Clara... No, listen to me. She reached out and did something she'd never done before. She put her hand on his arm, felt the tension there, the rigid control. You're not the problem. You've never been the problem. The problem is a town full of people who chose lies over truth, reputation over justice, comfort over doing what's right. That's not on you. That's on them. Doesn't change the fact that being near me hurts you. Being near you is the only thing that hasn't hurt me since my mother died. The confession came out before Clara could stop it, raw and honest and probably too much. But it was true. These months on the mountain, these conversations with a man who didn't pretend or lie or try to fix her, they'd been the only real thing in her life for longer than she wanted to admit. Caleb stared at her like she'd spoken a language he couldn't quite translate. You don't mean that. I do. You barely know me. I know you better than most people I've known my whole life. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to make sense. Clara's hand was still on his arm, and she could feel his pulse through the fabric of his shirt, quick and uncertain. I know you're honest even when it costs you. I know you're kind to animals and careful with broken things. I know you read poetry you don't understand just to feel something, and you bought a second cup 3 years before I showed up because some part of you still had hope. That's not... I know you wake up every morning and choose to keep going even though this world gave you every reason not to. I know you let me in when you didn't want to, and you told me the truth when you could have lied, and you're standing here worried about my reputation instead of your own. She took a breath. So yes, Caleb, I know you, and everything I know makes me want to stay. The silence that followed was absolute. Caleb looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, like everything he thought he understood had just shifted into a different shape. His hand came up slowly, carefully, and covered hers where it rested on his arm. If you stay, he said quietly, there's no going back. The town will decide what it means, and once they decide, that's who you'll be to them. You understand that? Yes. And you're still willing? Clara thought about her mother, about the letter, about promises made 23 years ago that had led her to this moment. She thought about the life she could have, safe, respectable, small, and she thought about the life she wanted. I'm still willing, she said. Caleb's hand tightened over hers. For a moment, Clara thought he might pull her closer, might close the distance that had always been there between them. But he didn't. Instead, he just held her hand and looked at her like she was something precious and terrifying in equal measure. All right, he said finally, then stay. So she did. The snow kept falling for 3 days straight. By the second morning, Clara had stopped thinking about going back to town and started thinking about how two people who barely knew how to be around each other were going to survive being trapped together on a mountain. It wasn't easy. Caleb was used to silence, to moving through his days with only his own thoughts for company. Having someone else in his space, even someone he'd invited, made him tense and awkward. He'd start to do something, then stop when he realized Clara was watching. He'd reach for the coffee pot at the same time she did and pull back like he'd been burned. The cabin that had felt spacious enough for one person suddenly felt cramped with two. Clara tried to give him room, but there wasn't much room to give. The cabin was maybe 20 feet across, and half of that was taken up by the stove and the table and the shelves. She'd offered to stay in the small bedroom, to keep out of his way, but Caleb had refused. "This is your home too now," he'd said, though the words seemed to cost him. "For 3 days," Clara had corrected, "for however long it takes." So they figured it out the hard way, through mistakes and awkward silences and moments when they both reached for the same thing and had to negotiate who got it first. Clara learned that Caleb liked his coffee before he spoke to anyone, that he did his thinking while working with his hands, that he got restless if he sat still for too long. Caleb learned that Clara organized things when she was nervous, that she bit her thumbnail when she was reading, that she hummed without realizing it. By the 3rd day, they'd found a rhythm. Caleb would wake first and start the fire. Clara would make breakfast, badly, but Caleb ate it anyway. He'd work on repairs around the cabin while Clara read or organized or found small projects to keep busy. They'd make lunch together, work separately in the afternoon, then come together again for dinner and the long evening hours when there was nothing to do but talk. And they talked. About everything and nothing. Clara told him about teaching, about students who couldn't sit still, and parents who thought their children could do no wrong, about the satisfaction of watching someone finally understand something they'd been struggling with. Caleb told her about ranching, about the year a bear got into his supplies and he'd had to live on potatoes for a month, about learning to read weather and animal signs, and the 100 small things that kept a man alive in the mountains. "You ever think about going back to teaching?" Caleb asked one night while they were cleaning up after dinner. Clara dried a plate slowly, thinking. "Sometimes, but I don't know if I could go back to being that person." "What person?" "The one who had all the answers, who stood in front of a classroom and pretended she knew what she was doing." She set the plate on the shelf. "I don't feel like that person anymore." "What do you feel like?" "Someone who's still figuring it out." Caleb nodded like that made sense. "I've been figuring it out for 12 years. Don't know if I'm any closer to answers." "Maybe that's not the point." "Then what is?" Clara turned to face him, leaning against the counter. "Maybe the point is just showing up every day and doing the next thing. And the next. Until eventually you look back and realize you've built something." "Built what?" "A life." The words sat between them like a weight. Caleb looked around the cabin, at the shelves he'd built, the table he'd made from salvaged wood, the small touches that turned 4 walls into something that felt like home. Then he looked at Clara, and something in his expression softened. "You think that's what I've been doing?" he asked. "I think that's what we've both been doing, just in different ways." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You're the first person who's made me think maybe I wasn't just surviving up here." "What were you doing?" "Living. Despite everything, despite all the reasons not to." Clara felt her chest tighten. "That's not a small thing, Caleb." "Feels small sometimes." "It's not." They stood there in the kitchen, close enough to touch, but not touching, and Clara realized with sudden clarity that something had shifted between them. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, no grand confession, no passionate moment. It was quieter than that, simpler. It was the recognition that they'd both been alone for so long that they'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen by another person. And now that they remembered, neither of them wanted to go back. On the 4th morning, the snow finally stopped. Clara woke to bright light streaming through the window and the sound of Caleb already up, moving around the cabin with purpose. When she came out of the bedroom, he was packing supplies into a canvas bag. "Trail should be passable by afternoon," he said without looking at her. "We can head down together. I'll explain to Mrs. Halloway that you got stuck because of weather." Clara's stomach dropped. She'd known this was coming, had known from the moment she agreed to stay that eventually the snow would stop and reality would come crashing back. But knowing it and facing it were different things. "All right," she said. Caleb finally looked at her, and Clara saw her own reluctance reflected in his expression. "Unless you want to wait another day, make sure the trail's completely clear." "Do you want me to wait another day?" The question hung between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying. Caleb set down the bag he'd been packing and crossed to where Clara stood. "I want—" He stopped, frustrated with himself. "I don't know what I want. That's the problem. You could just say it." "Say what?" "Whatever you're thinking. Whatever's making you look like you're about to fight a war inside your own head." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, and Clara noticed it was shaking slightly. I'm thinking that I spent 12 years convincing myself I was fine alone, that I didn't need anyone, didn't want anyone, that solitude was safer than risking getting hurt again. And then you showed up with your mother's letter and your stubborn streak, and everything I built to protect myself started falling apart. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. Part of me thinks yes. That I'm making the same mistake I made before, trusting someone, letting them in, thinking it might be different this time. And part of me thinks... He stopped again, searching for words. Thinks what? Clara asked softly. Thinks that maybe I've been protecting myself from the wrong thing. Maybe the real mistake wasn't trusting people. Maybe it was giving up on the idea that I deserved to be trusted back. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and sharp. You do deserve that. Do I? Because from where I'm standing, I'm a man who's been lying to himself for over a decade, telling himself he chose this isolation, that it was better this way, that he didn't need what other people needed. And now you're here, and I can't keep lying anymore. Then don't. It's not that simple. Why not? Caleb's hands clenched at his sides. Because admitting I need someone means admitting I've been wrong about everything. It means looking at the last 12 years and seeing them for what they really were. Not some noble exile, not some principled stand, but just a scared man hiding on a mountain because he was too hurt to face the world. The rawness in his voice nearly broke Clara. She closed the distance between them and took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and scars, the evidence of years spent working alone. You weren't just hiding, she said. You were surviving. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. Hiding is passive. Surviving takes effort. And you didn't just survive, Caleb. You built this place. You made a life up here when most people would have given up. That's not weakness. That's strength. Then why does it feel like I've been running away? Because you're human. Because being hurt changes us, and sometimes we need distance to heal. But you're not running anymore. Clara squeezed his hands. You're standing right here, with me. That's not running. Caleb looked at their joined hands like he couldn't quite believe they were real. I don't know how to do this. Do what? Be with someone. Share my life. Let someone see all the parts I've kept hidden. Neither do I. Then how? We figure it out, together. The same way we've been figuring out everything else. Clara met his eyes. You don't have to have all the answers, Caleb. You just have to be willing to try. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then he pulled her into his arms, sudden and fierce, like he was afraid she might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. Clara wrapped her arms around him and felt the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself together by force of will. I'm terrified, he said against her hair. Of what? That you'll leave. That you'll wake up one day and realize this was a mistake, that I'm not worth the trouble, that you deserve better than a broken man on a mountain. I'm not going anywhere. You say that now. I'll say it tomorrow too, and the day after, and the day after that. Clara pulled back enough to look at him. I'm not your town, Caleb. I'm not going to turn on you the first time things get hard. That's not who I am. How do you know? You've never been tested. Haven't I? My father died and my colleagues abandoned me. My mother died and I had no one. I came here with nothing but a letter and a promise I didn't understand, and I could have left a dozen times. But I stayed. She cupped his face in her hands. I stayed because I wanted to. Not because I had to. Not because of some obligation, because I chose you. The words landed like a hammer. Caleb's eyes went wide, and Clara realized she'd just said something they'd both been dancing around for months. She'd chosen him. Deliberately, consciously, with full knowledge of what it meant. Clara, I know it's fast. I know it doesn't make sense. I know we barely know each other in all the ways that are supposed to matter. But I also know that I've never felt more myself than when I'm with you. And I'm tired of pretending that doesn't mean something. Caleb's hands came up to cover hers where they rested against his face. It means everything. Then let it. He kissed her then, and it wasn't smooth or practiced or anything like the romantic scenes Clara had read about in books. It was awkward and desperate and too hard at first, both of them out of practice and uncertain, but it was real. It was honest. And when they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Clara saw something in Caleb's expression she'd never seen before. Hope. We should still go to town, he said after a moment, before Mrs. Halloway sends a search party. Clara laughed, slightly breathless. Probably. But after... He stopped, looking uncertain again. After? After you could come back if you wanted. Not just to visit, to stay. The offer hung in the air between them, massive and terrifying. Clara thought about the boarding house, about her small rented room, about the life she'd been building in town that had never quite felt like it fit. Then she thought about this cabin, about mornings with coffee and evenings by the fire, about building something real with someone who didn't ask her to be anyone other than who she was. "I'd need to get my things," she said. "I'll help you carry them. And we'd need to figure out sleeping arrangements. I can't keep taking your bed." "We'll figure it out. People are going to talk." "Let them." Clara smiled. "You say that now. I'll say it tomorrow too, and the day after, and the day after that." Caleb echoed her words back to her, and the corner of his mouth lifted in something close to a smile. "I'm not afraid of talk anymore, Clara. I'm afraid of losing this. Losing you. You won't. Promise?" "Promise." They packed in silence, both of them moving carefully around the enormity of what they'd just agreed to. Clara gathered her few belongings while Caleb loaded supplies into a pack: food for Mrs. Halloway, a letter for the post office, the book Clara had brought him that he wanted to return to the general store since he'd finished it in 2 days. The walk down was treacherous. Snow had melted and refrozen overnight, turning the trail into a ribbon of ice. Caleb went first, testing each step, reaching back to steady Clara when the ground was uncertain. They moved slowly, carefully, and Clara found herself grateful for the difficulty. It gave her time to think, to process what had just happened, to prepare for the conversation she knew was waiting at the bottom. They reached Red Hollow just after noon. The town looked smaller than Clara remembered, more cramped and suspicious. People stared as they walked down the main street, Clara with her hand in Caleb's, Caleb meeting their gazes without flinching. Clara saw Mrs. Halloway standing in the doorway of the boarding house, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "I'll do the talking," Caleb said quietly. "We'll do it together." He looked at her, surprised, then nodded. Mrs. Halloway didn't move as they approached. Her eyes went from Clara to Caleb and back again, taking in their joined hands, the pack on Caleb's shoulder, the way they stood close enough to touch. "Got stuck in the snow," Caleb said. "Trail was too dangerous to risk. Brought her back as soon as it was safe." Mrs. Halloway's gaze sharpened. 4 days. "Yes, ma'am. And you expect me to believe nothing happened? I expect you to believe what you want. You will anyway." The older woman's mouth thinned. Then, surprisingly, she stepped aside. "Come in, both of you. You look half frozen." They followed her inside to the common room. Mrs. Halloway poured coffee, real coffee, not the weak stuff she usually served, and set cups in front of them without comment. Then she sat down across the table and folded her hands. "I've known you since you were barely old enough to shave, Caleb Ridge," she said. "Knew your mother before she passed. Knew what kind of man you were before Kern told his lies. And I know what kind of man you are now." Caleb's expression stayed neutral. "And what kind is that?" "The kind who'd rather cut off his own hand than dishonor a woman under his roof." She turned to Clara. "So when you tell me nothing happened, I'll believe you. But you need to understand what this looks like." "I know what it looks like," Clara said. "Do you? Because once this story gets out, and it will, there's no taking it back. You'll be the woman who spent 4 days alone with Caleb Ridge. Doesn't matter what actually happened. The damage is done." "Then it's done." Mrs. Halloway sat back, studying Clara with new interest. "You're not worried about your reputation." "Not anymore." "Why not?" Clara glanced at Caleb, then back at Mrs. Halloway. "Because I've spent my whole life worrying about what other people thought. About being respectable and appropriate and everything a proper woman should be. And it didn't protect me. It didn't stop my colleagues from abandoning me when things got hard. It didn't make my mother's death any easier. It didn't give me anything except the approval of people who didn't actually care about me." She took a breath. "So no, I'm not worried about my reputation. I'm worried about building a life that feels real. And if that means people talk, then let them talk." The silence that followed was thick. Mrs. Halloway's expression had softened, though her eyes were still sharp. "You're moving up there," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "When?" "Today. As soon as I can pack." Mrs. Halloway nodded slowly. "Then you'll need supplies. Can't live on what Caleb's got stored. Winter's only half over." Caleb frowned. "Mrs. Halloway." Don't argue with me, boy. You want her up there, you make sure she's provided for. I'll put together a list. You can settle up when you come down for spring trading. The unexpected support seemed to catch Caleb off guard. He looked at the older woman like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. Mrs. Halloway's expression turned sad. "Because I too should have helped you 12 years ago when Kern was spreading his lies. Should have spoken up, should have stood by you, should have done something other than watch this town destroy a good man over nothing." She reached across the table and squeezed Caleb's hand briefly. "I can't fix what happened, but I can help you now. If you'll let me." Caleb's throat worked. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You've still got to face the rest of them." She stood and began pulling supplies from the shelves. "Doc Martin will be on your side, I expect. He's always felt guilty about the whole business. And the barkeeper liked your mother. He'll keep the worst of the talk down at the saloon." "What about everyone else?" Clara asked. "Everyone else will do what small-town people always do. They'll gossip and judge and make assumptions. But they'll get bored eventually. Something new will happen, and you'll stop being interesting." Mrs. Halloway set a sack of flour on the table. "The question is whether you two can weather it until then." Clara looked at Caleb. He looked back at her, and she saw the question in his eyes. "Are you sure?" She thought about everything that had led her to this moment. Her mother's letter, the mountain, the slow building of trust between two people who'd both been hurt, the recognition that sometimes the right choice looked nothing like the safe one. "We can weather it," she said. Mrs. Halloway smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "Then let's get you packed." It took 2 hours to gather everything Clara needed. Her trunk from the boarding house, supplies from the general store, blankets and tools and practical things she'd need for life on a mountain. People stared as she and Caleb loaded everything into a borrowed wagon. Some looked scandalized. Others looked curious. A few looked almost approving. Doc Martin stopped them as they were finishing. "Heard you two got stuck in the snow," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "That's right," Caleb replied. The old doctor studied them both, then nodded. "Happens this time of year. Dangerous trail, smart to wait it out." He handed Caleb a small bundle. "Medical supplies. In case you need them up there. I'll add it to your account." "Doc, don't argue. Just take it." Doc Martin's expression softened. "I'm glad you're not alone anymore, son. Your mother would be too." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he took the supplies. "Thank you." They left Red Hollow in the late afternoon, the wagon creaking under the weight of Clara's new life. The climb back up the mountain was slow, the horse struggling with the load, but neither of them minded. They were in no hurry. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting everything gold and red. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop and just sat there for a moment, looking at the cabin like he was seeing it fresh. "It's not much," he said. "It's enough. You might change your mind once winter really sets in. Gets cold, gets dark, gets lonely." Clara climbed down from the wagon and came around to his side. "Gets lonely, huh? Even with 2 people?" "I don't know. Never had 2 people before." She smiled. "Then I guess we're both figuring it out." They unloaded the wagon together as darkness fell, carrying Clara's trunk into the cabin, stacking supplies in the small pantry, making room for her things alongside Caleb's. It was practical, unglamorous work, but there was something profound about it too. Every item they put away was a statement. This is real. This is happening. This is our life now. When the wagon was empty and everything was stored, they stood in the cabin and looked around at what they'd built in the space of a single day. Clara's books on the shelf next to Caleb's, her clothes hanging beside his, her mother's pocket watch on the mantel, keeping its broken time alongside the small carved animals Caleb whittled on long winter nights. "Still feels like a dream," Caleb said quietly. "Dreams don't usually involve this much heavy lifting." He laughed, and the sound was so unexpected, so genuine, that Clara found herself laughing too. They stood there in the lamplight, tired and dirty, and probably making a huge mistake by anyone's standards, and Clara had never been more certain of anything in her life. "I love you," she said. The words came out simple and true, without ceremony or build-up. Caleb froze, his eyes going wide. "You don't have to say it back," Clara added quickly. "I just wanted you to know." He crossed to her in 3 strides and pulled her close. "I don't know how to say it. Don't have the words for what this feels like." You don't need words. Then what do I need? Clara leaned into him, feeling his heart beating against her cheek. You just need to keep showing up. Keep being honest. Keep letting me see you, even the parts that scare you. I can do that. Then we're fine. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the quiet cabin while night settled over the mountain. Outside, wind moved through the pines, and somewhere an owl called. Inside, two people who'd spent too long alone began the difficult, beautiful work of learning to be together. It wouldn't be perfect. They'd fight about small things and struggle with the adjustment and probably drive each other crazy before they figured out how to make it work. But they'd do it together. And that, Clara thought, was worth more than any promise her mother could have made. The first month was harder than either of them expected. They'd known it wouldn't be easy. Two people who'd lived alone for years suddenly sharing 20 feet of space, learning each other's habits, navigating the 1,000 small compromises that came with building a life together. But knowing it would be hard and living through it were different things. Caleb still woke before dawn out of habit, moving quietly through the cabin like he was trying not to disturb someone who wasn't there. Then he'd remember Clara was actually there, asleep in the bed they now shared, and he'd freeze halfway through making coffee, uncertain whether to be quiet or just live normally. Clara would wake to find him standing motionless by the stove, caught between his old life and his new one, and she'd have to remind him that she wasn't made of glass. You can make noise, she'd say. I'm not going to break. I know. Then stop tiptoeing around like you're afraid I'll disappear. Can't help it. And that was the truth of it. Caleb couldn't help the fear that lived just under his skin, the voice that whispered this was too good to last, that Clara would wake up one morning and realize she'd made a terrible mistake. He tried to hide it, but Clara saw it anyway, in the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the careful way he handled her things like they might vanish if he wasn't gentle enough. Clara had her own adjustments to make. She'd lived independently for years, made her own decisions, answered to no one. Now there was someone else to consider in everything she did. Someone who had opinions about how to stack firewood and when to collect eggs and whether it made sense to reorganize the entire pantry by category instead of by frequency of use. It's more efficient this way, she'd argued one afternoon, surrounded by jars and tins she'd pulled from the shelves. It was fine the way it was. Fine isn't the same as good. It worked for 12 years. That doesn't mean it couldn't work better. They'd stared at each other across the chaos of the pantry, both stubborn, both certain they were right. Then Caleb had laughed, that unexpected, rough sound that still surprised Clara every time she heard it, and the tension had broken. Do whatever you want with it, he'd said. Just leave the coffee where I can find it in the dark. Deal. Those were the easy fights. The hard ones came when they bumped against each other's scars. Clara had a habit of going quiet when she was upset, withdrawing into herself the way she'd learned to do after her father died. Caleb hated the silence. It reminded him too much of the years alone, of conversations that never happened because there was no one to have them with. When Clara went quiet, he'd push, trying to get her to talk, and she'd push back by going even quieter, and they'd spiral until one of them broke. Usually it was Caleb who broke first. I can't do the silence, he'd said one night after they'd been circling each other for hours over something neither of them could even remember starting. I know you need space to think, but the quiet makes me crazy. Makes me think you're already gone, even though you're standing right there. Clara had looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read. I'm not gone. I'm just processing. I know. But I need you to process out loud sometimes. Need to know what's happening in your head so I don't fill it in with my own worst assumptions. It had been a fair request. Clara had nodded and made an effort after that to speak her thoughts instead of swallowing them. And Caleb had made an effort to give her space when she needed it, to trust that silence didn't always mean distance. They learned each other slowly, through trial and error, and the kind of mistakes that felt catastrophic in the moment but became stories later. Like the time Clara tried to help with the livestock and left the gate unlatched, and they'd spent 3 hours chasing chickens through the snow. Or the time Caleb tried to surprise her with breakfast in bed and nearly set the cabin on fire because he'd gotten distracted and forgotten the pan on the stove. I thought you said you could cook, Clara had said, standing in the doorway in her nightgown, staring at the smoke. I can cook. I got distracted. By what? By watching you sleep. The honesty of it had stolen Clara's breath. She'd crossed to him through the smoke and kissed him hard enough to make them both forget about the ruined eggs and the burnt pan and everything except the fact that they were here, together, building something neither of them had thought they deserved. Winter deepened and the world outside contracted to just the ranch and the mountains and the sky. They were snowed in for days at a time, the trail completely impassable, and Clara learned what Caleb had meant about isolation. It wasn't just the lack of other people. It was the way the silence pressed in, heavy and complete, until the only sounds were wind and fire and their own voices. But Clara found she didn't mind it the way she'd thought she would. There was something peaceful about being cut off from the world, about knowing that for these few months, nothing existed except this cabin and this man and the life they were trying to build. No judgments from town, no expectations, no ghosts of who they'd been before. Just them. They developed routines. Mornings were for chores, feeding animals, collecting eggs, checking fences, splitting wood. Afternoons were for individual projects, Caleb working on repairs, Clara reading or writing letters she'd send when the trail cleared. Evenings were for each other. They'd cook dinner together, clean up together, then settle by the fire with books or cards or just conversation. Clara learned that Caleb was terrible at cards, but played anyway because he liked watching her get competitive. She learned he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, that he could fix almost anything with enough time and patience, that he sang to the livestock when he thought no one was listening. She learned the shape of his scars, the burn on his forearm from a forge accident when he was 16, the crooked finger that had healed wrong after a horse stepped on it, the long line across his ribs from barbed wire he'd gotten tangled in during a storm. Caleb learned that Clara talked to herself when she was working through a problem, that she had strong opinions about the proper way to shelve books, that she cried during thunderstorms because they reminded her of the night her father died. He learned she was braver than she thought she was, funnier than she gave herself credit for, and that she had a talent for finding beauty in small things. The way morning light hit the frost on the windows, the pattern of animal tracks in fresh snow, the particular shade of purple the sky turned just before dark. They learned how to fight fair, how to say, "I need space" without it meaning I'm leaving, how to apologize without making excuses, how to forgive without keeping score. It wasn't easy, and they stumbled more often than not, but they kept trying. One night in late February, after a particularly difficult day where everything had gone wrong and they'd both been short with each other, Caleb had pulled Clara onto the porch despite the cold. "Look," he'd said, pointing up. The sky was full of stars, more than Clara had ever seen, spread thick across the darkness like someone had spilled salt. The Milky Way cut across the center, a river of light, and Clara had felt herself go still with wonder. "I forget sometimes," Caleb had said quietly. "When I'm stuck in my own head, when everything feels hard, I forget to look up. Forget that all of this—" He gestured at the mountains, the sky, the vast wilderness surrounding them. "All of this is still here, still beautiful, still worth it." Clara had leaned into him, feeling his warmth against the cold. "Is that your way of apologizing for being grumpy all day?" "Maybe. It's a good apology. Thought you might like it better than words." And he'd been right. Clara did like it better than words. She liked that he showed her things instead of just telling her. Liked that he trusted her to understand what he meant without him having to explain everything. Liked that after all these months, they were finally learning to speak the same language. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, like it always did in the mountains. The snow began to melt in fits and starts, turning the trail to mud, then freezing again overnight. Caleb started talking about the work that needed doing. Fences to repair, the roof to check, seeds to plant once the ground thawed. Clara started talking about Red Hollow, about the supplies they'd need, about facing the town again after months of isolation. "You nervous?" Caleb asked one morning while they were checking the fence line. "A little. You?" "More than a little." Clara wasn't surprised. Caleb hadn't been to town since the day they'd loaded the wagon with her things. Mrs. Halloway had sent supplies up with a boy she'd hired to make deliveries, and Doc Martin had checked on them once when the trail was clear, but Caleb had avoided going down himself. "We could send a list," Clara offered. "Have someone else get the supplies." "No." Caleb drove a post into the ground with more force than necessary. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of letting them think they won." "They didn't win." "Didn't they?" "I'm still up here, still avoiding them. Still letting what happened 12 years ago control what I do now. Clara leaned against the fence. What changed? Caleb looked at her, and Clara saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Something solid and certain. You did. You came up here and stayed when you should have left. You chose me when you could have chosen safe. And if you can be that brave, I can walk into town and buy flour. It's more than buying flour. I know. People are going to stare. They're going to talk. Let them. Caleb, I mean it. He set down the post driver and came to stand in front of her. I spent 12 years being afraid of what they thought, being defined by their judgment, and it nearly destroyed me. But you showed me something better. You showed me that the only opinion that matters is my own and yours. And I know what I think about myself now. I know who I am, and I'm done letting them tell me different. Clara felt her throat tighten. I'm proud of you. Don't be. Not yet. Ask me again after I've actually done it. They went to town the following week. On the first day, the trail was completely clear. Caleb drove the wagon with his shoulders tight and his jaw set, and Clara sat beside him pretending she wasn't watching him for signs of panic. When Red Hollow came into view, small and brown against the greening hills, she felt Caleb's hand find hers. Together? He asked. Together. They drove down the main street at noon, when everyone would be out, when there'd be no avoiding the stares and whispers. Clara kept her head up and her hand in Caleb's, and she felt the weight of every eye in town tracking their progress. Mrs. Halloway was sweeping the porch of the boarding house when they pulled up. She set down her broom and came to meet them with a smile that looked genuine. About time you two showed your faces, she said. Was starting to think you'd frozen to death up there. Close, Caleb said, climbing down from the wagon. But we made it. I can see that. Mrs. Halloway looked them over with sharp eyes. You both look good. Better than when you left. It was true. Caleb had put on weight over the winter, lost the gaunt look that came from years of not quite eating enough. Clara had color in her cheeks and calluses on her hands from work. They looked like people who'd been living instead of just surviving. They made their rounds. The general store for supplies, the post office for letters, Doc Martin's office to settle accounts. At each stop, people stared. Some looked curious. Some looked disapproving. A few looked almost relieved, like they'd been worried despite themselves. The barkeeper was the first to speak what others were probably thinking. Heard you two got hitched over the winter, he said when they stopped in for coffee. That true? Clara felt Caleb tense beside her. They hadn't gotten married, hadn't talked about it, hadn't made it official in any way that mattered to the law. But they'd made promises to each other, built a life together, and in every way that mattered to them, they were committed. Working on it, Caleb said carefully. The barkeeper nodded like that was answer enough. Well, congratulations anyway. Your mother would be happy, Caleb. Always said you needed someone to keep you honest. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Thank you. They left the saloon and walked back to the wagon in silence. Clara waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. We should make it official, she said. Caleb looked at her. You want to get married? Don't you? He stopped, seeming to really think about it. I guess I assumed we already were, in the ways that mattered. We are, but it might make things easier, for legal stuff, for when people ask. Is that the only reason? Clara thought about it. No. I want to marry you because I love you, because I want everyone to know I chose you deliberately, not because I got stuck in a snowstorm and had no other options. Caleb's expression softened. When? Whenever you want. Spring, he said, on the land. Where we built this. You sure? I'm sure. They married 6 weeks later on a clear May morning with the mountains standing witness. Doc Martin presided. Mrs. Halloway stood as witness, and the barkeeper showed up uninvited but was welcomed anyway. It was a small ceremony, simple and quick, but it felt right. No church, no crowd, no performance for people who didn't really care. Just two people making promises they intended to keep. Clara wore a dress Mrs. Halloway had helped her make from fabric they'd ordered from the catalog. It was blue, the color of sky before a storm, and it fit her better than anything she'd ever owned. Caleb wore a new shirt and his cleanest pants and looked so nervous Clara had to bite back a smile. You all right? she whispered while Doc Martin was setting up. Terrified. Of what? We're already living together. This doesn't change anything. Doesn't it? This makes it real. Makes it something I can't take back. You want to take it back? No, but I want you to be sure. Clara took his hands. I'm sure. I've been sure since that day in the snow when I told you I was staying. This is just making it official for everyone else. What if I mess it up? You will. We both will. But we'll figure it out. She smiled. That's kind of our thing, remember? Figuring it out as we go. Doc Martin cleared his throat. You two ready? They turned to face him, hands still joined, and spoke the words that transformed their choice into something recognized by law and community. When it was done, when they'd been pronounced husband and wife, Caleb had pulled Clara close and kissed her like they weren't standing in front of witnesses, like the whole world had narrowed to just the two of them. Mrs. Halloway had sniffed loudly and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. About damn time, she'd muttered. They celebrated with a meal back at the cabin. Nothing fancy, just roasted chicken and vegetables from the root cellar and a cake Mrs. Halloway had baked that morning. It was exactly what Clara wanted. No fuss, no pretense, just good food and better company, and the feeling that they'd built something that would last. The barkeeper raised his glass when the meal was finished. To Caleb and Clara, he said, may you have the courage to keep choosing each other when it gets hard. They drank to that, and Clara thought about how strange courage was. People always thought of it as something big and dramatic, slaying dragons, fighting battles, grand gestures in the face of danger. But real courage was quieter than that. It was getting up every day and trying again, even when yesterday was hard. It was saying, I'm sorry, when you were wrong, and I love you, when you were scared. It was choosing connection over safety, vulnerability over protection, trust over cynicism. Caleb had shown that courage when he told her about Kern, when he let her stay, when he walked into town and faced the people who'd abandoned him. Clara had shown it when she climbed that mountain the first time, when she stayed through the snow, when she built a life in a place she'd never planned to be. And they'd keep showing it, every day, in 1,000 small ways that no one else would ever see, but that would build, over time, into something unshakable. The first year of marriage was an education. They learned that love wasn't enough on its own. It needed work and compromise and the willingness to keep showing up even when you didn't feel like it. They learned to fight without being cruel, to forgive without keeping score, to ask for what they needed instead of expecting the other person to read their mind. Caleb learned to share his space, his life, his fears. Clara learned to be patient with his process, to trust that when he went quiet, it didn't mean he was pulling away, to give him room to work through things in his own time. They built routines that felt like home, morning coffee on the porch when weather allowed, evening walks through the property, Friday nights reserved for cards and conversation, small rituals that marked time and gave shape to their days. The town came around slowly. Some people never did. They'd decided who Caleb was 12 years ago and saw no reason to revise their opinion. But others began to soften. The shopkeeper started greeting him by name. The postmaster stopped watching him like he might steal something. People nodded when he passed on the street instead of crossing to avoid him. It helped that Clara was there. People liked her. She was friendly without being pushy, competent without being threatening. She started teaching reading to some of the younger children whose parents couldn't afford formal school, and word got around that she was good at it. When someone needed help with bookkeeping or letter writing, they'd ask Clara. And Clara came as a package deal with Caleb now. Jonas Kern died the second winter of Clara and Caleb's marriage. Heart gave out in his sleep, the doctor said. Quick and painless, which was more than he deserved. Caleb heard the news at the general store and stood there for a long moment, processing. You all right? Clara asked when they got back to the wagon. I don't know. I thought I'd feel something. Relief, maybe, or anger. But I just feel empty. Yeah, Clara took his hand. That's normal. He took something from you. Even though he's gone, that doesn't give it back. Then what does? Time, maybe. Or choosing to build something new instead of trying to get back what was lost. Caleb looked at her. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just good at saying things that sound wise. He'd laughed, and the sound had been lighter than Clara expected. Whatever hold Kern's ghost had kept on Caleb, it loosened that day. Not completely. Some scars ran too deep for that, but enough that Caleb could breathe easier, could walk through town without the weight of old accusations pressing on his shoulders. 3 years into their marriage, Clara got pregnant. It wasn't planned. They talked about children in abstract terms, but hadn't made any decisions. But when she missed her monthly courses and Doc Martin confirmed her suspicions, Clara found she wasn't afraid. Nervous, yes. Uncertain about bringing a child into a life that was still being figured out. But not afraid. Caleb, on the other hand, was terrified. "What if I'm a terrible father?" he'd said when Clara told him. "What if I mess them up the way I'm messed up?" "You're not messed up. Clara, you're not. You're a person who's been hurt and is still learning how to heal. That's not the same as being broken beyond repair. What if I can't protect them?" "From what?" "From everything. From the world. From people who'll judge them because of who I am." Clara had cupped his face in her hands. "Listen to me. Any child we have will be loved, will be wanted, will grow up knowing that their parents chose each other deliberately and built something real. That's more than a lot of kids get. We'll make mistakes. Every parent does. But we'll also show up and we'll try and we'll figure it out, just like we figured out everything else." Their daughter was born in early spring, delivered by Doc Martin in the cabin where she'd been conceived. They named her Margaret, after Clara's mother, and called her Maggie for short. Caleb fell in love with her immediately and completely. Clara watched him hold their daughter for the first time, saw the way his hands shook and his eyes went wet, and knew that whatever fears he'd had about fatherhood were being rewritten in real time. "She's so small," he'd whispered. "She'll grow. What if I drop her?" "You won't." "How do you know?" "Because you're the most careful person I've ever met. You'll be fine." And he was. Not perfect. No parent ever was. But he was present. He was patient. He changed diapers and walked the floor during sleepless nights and sang lullabies in his rough voice that somehow always worked. He built a cradle that rocked smooth as water and carved tiny animals for Maggie to play with when she got old enough. Clara watched him become a father and fell in love with him all over again. The town celebrated Maggie's birth the way small towns did, with casseroles and baby blankets and endless advice that Clara mostly ignored. Mrs. Halloway showed up with a quilt she'd been working on for months, each square embroidered with something from the mountains: pine trees, deer, eagles, flowers. It was beautiful and practical and probably the nicest gift anyone had ever made for Clara. "She's got your eyes," Mrs. Halloway said, looking down at Maggie, "but her father's stubborn chin." "Poor thing," Clara had said, and they'd both laughed. Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Harder in some ways. Less sleep, less time alone, less freedom to do things on impulse. But richer, too. Fuller. Maggie brought joy that Clara hadn't known she was missing. Her first smile, her first laugh, the way she'd grip Caleb's finger and hold on like her life depended on it, these small moments became the texture of their days. Caleb started going to town more regularly. Not because he had to, but because Maggie needed things. Clothes as she grew, toys, eventually books. And because he wanted her to know the world beyond the mountain. He wanted her to grow up comfortable with people, confident in her place in the community, free from the isolation that had nearly destroyed him. People responded to Maggie the way people always responded to babies, with softness and generosity and the kind of goodwill that crossed old boundaries. The shopkeeper gave her peppermints. The barkeeper's wife knitted her booties. Even people who'd never quite forgiven Caleb for sins he didn't commit found it hard to stay cold in the face of a child's smile. Slowly, imperceptibly, the town's relationship with Caleb shifted. He'd never be entirely free of what happened with Kern. Some people had long memories and longer grudges, but he was no longer defined solely by that moment. He was also Maggie's father, Clara's husband, the man who ran a good ranch and kept his word and showed up when he said he would. One afternoon when Maggie was 2, Caleb came home from town with news. "Kern's brother stopped me on the street," he said while helping Clara with dinner prep. Clara's hand stilled. "What did he want?" "To apologize. Said he knew Jonas lied about the fire. Said he should have spoken up at the time but was afraid of going against family." Caleb set down the knife he'd been using. "Said he was sorry for all of it." "What did you say?" "I said thank you. What else could I say?" Clara turned to face him. "Are you angry?" I was. For about 5 seconds, I was furious. 12 years too late, you know. Where was this apology when I needed it? He paused. But then I thought about us, about Maggie, about everything I've built since then, and I realized that if things had been different, if the town had believed me and I'd stayed, I might never have come up here. Might never have been alone when you showed up with that letter. We might never have happened. So you're grateful for it? No, it was still wrong. It still hurt, but I'm not letting it define the rest of my life. I took his apology and I'm moving on. Clara crossed to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. I'm proud of you. You're always saying that. That's because you keep giving me reasons. They stood there in the kitchen while Maggie played with blocks on the floor and dinner simmered on the stove, and Clara thought about how far they'd come. From two broken people on a mountain to this, a family, a home, a life that felt real and solid and theirs. The years passed the way years do, quickly and slowly at the same time. Maggie grew from baby to toddler to little girl. She learned to walk, to talk, to climb trees and chase chickens and ask endless questions about everything. She had her mother's curiosity and her father's quiet determination, and she grew up knowing only love and safety. Caleb taught her to track animals and read weather and split kindling without hitting her thumb. Clara taught her to read and write and see beauty in small things. Together, they taught her that love was work, that families were built through choice as much as blood, that mistakes were just opportunities to try again. Red Hollow became less suspicious of the odd family on the mountain and more accepting. Caleb joined the volunteer firefighting brigade. Clara organized a lending library out of the boarding house. They showed up for community events, contributed to barn raisings and harvest celebrations, became part of the fabric of the town in ways that had seemed impossible those first months. One evening when Maggie was 7, after she'd gone to bed and Clara and Caleb were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Clara asked the question she'd been holding for years. Do you ever wonder what my mother knew? What she saw when she met you all those years ago that made her think we'd end up here? Caleb was quiet for a long time. Sometimes. But I think maybe she didn't know exactly. I think maybe she just saw two people who'd need each other someday and tried to make sure we'd find our way together. That's a lot of faith. Yeah, it is. You think we would have found each other without the letter? I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe we would have both stayed stuck. You in Pennsylvania, me up here, neither of us brave enough to change. He turned to look at her. Does it matter? Clara thought about it. No, I guess it doesn't. We're here now. That's what matters. Here now, Caleb repeated. He reached for her hand. Sometimes I still can't believe it's real. That you stayed. That we built this. Believe it. We've got 7 years of proof sleeping in the next room. Best proof I ever had. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the first stars appeared. In the cabin behind them, Maggie slept peacefully, dreaming whatever 7-year-olds dreamed about. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, having witnessed this story and 1,000 others like it. Stories of people finding each other against odds, building lives in hard places, choosing connection over isolation. 15 years after Clara first climbed that mountain with a letter she didn't understand, she stood in the same spot and looked back at the trail. It was easier now. They'd widened it over the years, made it safer, added markers so people wouldn't get lost. Maggie ran it like a rabbit, up and down without thinking, as comfortable on the mountain as she was anywhere. Clara was 42 now, no longer the uncertain woman who'd stepped off the train in Red Hollow. Her hands were permanently rough from work, her face lined from sun and wind, her hair starting to show silver. She'd lived more in these 15 years than in all the years before combined. Caleb came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. At 53, he'd gone mostly gray, though he was still strong from work, still careful with his words, still prone to moments of quiet wonder at the fact that this was his life. What are you thinking about? He asked. How different everything is. How different I am. Better different? Clara leaned back against him. Yeah, better different. No regrets? Not one. It was true. Clara had given up the life she'd planned, teaching in a proper school, living in a real town, being the respectable woman everyone expected her to be. She'd traded it for this, a ranch on a mountain, a husband with a past, a daughter who ran wild and free. She'd traded safety for truth, comfort for connection, other people's approval for her own. And she'd do it again in a heartbeat. That's what people didn't understand about love, Clara thought. It wasn't about finding someone perfect or building something perfect or having a perfect life together. It was about finding someone you could be imperfect with, someone who saw your scars and stayed anyway, someone who chose you deliberately, repeatedly, even when it was hard. Caleb had chosen her. Every day for 15 years he'd chosen her. When she was difficult and stubborn and impossible. When she reorganized his entire cabin and challenged his assumptions and pushed him to be more than he thought he could be. He'd chosen her through all of it, and she'd chosen him. The man the town had abandoned, the man who'd built walls so high he'd almost disappeared behind them, the man who'd been so afraid of being hurt again that he'd nearly missed his chance at healing. She'd chosen him and kept choosing him, through the hard days and the easy ones, through fights and forgiveness, and the slow, patient work of building trust. Their daughter chose them both. Every time she ran to them with scraped knees or exciting discoveries or questions about the world. Every time she told them she loved them. Every time she showed up exactly as she was, without fear or hesitation, trusting that they'd love her anyway. That's what Clara's mother had given her in the end. Not answers. Not a clear path. Just the opportunity to choose something real over something safe. The chance to walk into silence and find out what was on the other side. The sun finished setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep blue. Somewhere in the valley below, Red Hollow was settling in for the night. Lights coming on in windows, families gathering for dinner, the town humming along as it always had. But up here on the mountain, Clara and Caleb stood together in the growing dark, holding each other the way they'd learned to do, firmly but gently, with room to breathe but close enough to feel safe. Behind them, their daughter was probably sneaking extra time with her books before bed, pushing boundaries the way healthy children did. This was their life. Imperfect, complicated, built from nothing but choice and work and the stubborn refusal to give up when things got hard. It wasn't the life Clara had imagined for herself all those years ago in Pennsylvania. It was better, because it was real, because it was theirs, because they'd built it together, piece by piece, from the ruins of what they'd been before. And that, Clara thought as Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple, was worth every difficult step it took to get here. Worth the judgment and the gossip and the fear. Worth the hard winters and the harder conversations and the 1,000 small deaths of ego that came with learning to truly share a life with someone. Love wasn't perfect. Life wasn't perfect. But this, standing on a mountain with a man who'd learned to trust again, raising a daughter who'd never know the loneliness they'd escaped, building something that would outlast them both. This was as close to perfect as imperfect people could get. And Clara wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.